Okay, well, we have a lot of attendees that have logged in, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Master of Science in Data Analytics and Policy at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you very much for joining us. This is actually our second virtual Government Analytics Breakfast Forum, and today we are running an afternoon edition because we are thrilled to have a speaker from the West Coast joining us. We, generally speaking, host the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum along with REI Systems as a way to bring together professionals and academics to form a community of people who are interested in how the public sector can use analytics to improve governance and policymaking. Our speaker today will present for about 40 minutes or so, and afterwards we strongly encourage your participation. We very much want our events, including our virtual events, to serve as a discussion forum about the possibilities and challenges associated with analytics. We also encourage you to tweet about the event using the hashtag #GabForum, and a recording of the event will be available in about 24 hours, and you are very welcome to share that with interested colleagues. So at this point, I will turn the program over to my co-host, Jeff Myers of REI Systems, to introduce our speaker. And once again, just want to thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon to participate today.
Thanks very much, Jen. As Jim points out, a lot of the purpose of this is to try and share ideas and how people have overcome challenges. We mostly have government speakers. In this occasion, we have a speaker from the private sector, and I'll tell you a little bit about why in a moment. I'd like to introduce REI, though. If you're not familiar with REI Systems, we do a wide range of both creating and running analytic models, as well as developing the tools and helping government agencies use them. Recently, those have included, for example, analytics with helping health clinics with COVID for our client, the Health Resources and Services Administration, helping identify and manage and determine impacts of natural disasters for FEMA, and helping with immigration analytics for USCIS. And frankly, our business is growing at 20% a year. So if those of you who are looking around interested in career opportunities in analytics, we would love to hear from you. Many of REI's clients in particular seek innovation, and the reason that we structured this event today is because there are a number of government agencies, let's take for example NASA or the National Science Foundation, that are both seeking basic research as well as applied research into a variety of types of innovation to meet their needs. One example I always like to point out is NASA looked hard for small businesses that would help equip its Mars rover to be able to determine whether or not there are precursors to life on Mars by doing soil analysis. And it found that with a small business. So that was a successful instance of a government seeking innovation for a particular mission purpose. But we thought, you know what, there are other folks out who are seeking innovation as well and have some good experience doing it. And so a person that I've known and have a great respect for over 15 years has agreed to join us. Rob Ness is the managing partner of a venture capital firm. And I think he can tell us a little bit about how venture capitalists seek innovation, find innovation, and use analytics as part of their efforts to do so. Some of those things may be useful and applicable to government agencies, perhaps not all of them. But again, this is intended to kind of create a dialogue and share ideas. With that, I'd like to introduce Rob Ness, who is the general partner of Asymmetry Ventures. He actually, in addition to being the managing partner of a venture capital fund, he's kind of organized a consortium of what are called angel investors, which are wealthy individuals who are not part of a fund necessarily in that instance, but are also seeking opportunities to invest typically in small businesses at the earliest stages of startup. So Rob has both a tremendous network and some very significant experience. Conveniently and coincidentally, Rob has also offered advice on a number of occasions to several different government agencies in consulting roles. So he actually kind of walked on both sides of the fence, and I think we'll have a great deal of insight to offer you in terms of seeking innovation, finding it, and some of the contrasts between what venture capitalist firms do and what the government may do. With that, please let me turn it over to Rob. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. It's wonderful to be here. I really thought it would be a treat to be able to address this audience. And also, I was certainly going to say yes to Jeff because Jeff was my first manager coming out of grad school. And Jeff is that rare combination of being not only a good manager, which by itself is hard to find, but also just a golden human being. So Jeff probably could have asked me to go over the Niagara Falls in a barrel. I would have said yes. So here I am. And on top of that, it's also a privilege to be able to talk to all of you because as you'll hear, almost all of my professional background was in the public sector. So to be able to offer some insights and possible frameworks for ways that federal agencies might think about innovation slightly differently, using some of the perspectives of the venture capital world. If that helps some of these agencies look at how they go about doing their business a little bit differently, then that's really a privilege for me to be able to do. So let me weigh in on why I think I might just be the right person to talk about this. It's not because I am a major or notable VC fund. I'm not. I have a very small fund. It is really, at best, a drop in the bucket out of the billions of dollars that flow into Silicon Valley, not just annually, but monthly. Rather, I think the reason I might be the right person to talk to you about this topic is because I am a bit of an odd duck professionally. VCs are generally either people who have been former founders who successfully launched a startup and now they're playing on the other side of the table as the investor, or at least they have some kind of business background or a background in tech as a programmer or an engineer. I'm one of the not unheard of, but relatively unusual specimens of somebody who has spent most of their career working in and around the public sector, but now I find myself managing a VC fund. So I went to college at UC Berkeley in the 90s, and my first job after college was in the public sector, but actually at the state and local level, working with state and local governments across the country. My master's degree was a public administration degree at Harvard Kennedy School, which incidentally is also Jeff's alma mater. And then my job right out of grad school was working with Jeff at Booz Allen, where we were working in the company's organizational performance unit, helping federal agencies improve their performance as an agency, their organizational performance, which broadly means helping them conceptualize their goals as an agency, figuring out the metrics that define success or failure against those goals, and then helping those agencies build the programs, processes, and systems to achieve those goals. I work with agencies that I'm sure you all have heard of: Department of Defense, Homeland Security, OMB, GAO. We spend a lot of time thinking about and helping my federal clients figure out what it looked like for a federal agency to get it right. I should also mention that on the side, I've also been an officer in the US Army Reserve for about 17 years and counting. So I do have a sense, not just of what it's like to support federal agencies, but also to be on the payroll, at least part-time on a weekend basis. So in all of these settings, there's always that sense of mission when you're working in the government, that you are steering the country, hopefully, in the right direction. Another way we used to think about it is this concept of creating public value, that's what a federal agency really exists to do, to create value for the people that it serves. So that's my background and a description of how I come very much from the public sector. How in the world did I get involved in venture investing? Well, starting right after I had come out of grad school and was starting to work as a federal contractor with all of these agencies, working on organizational performance, working side by side with government program managers and federal executives, trying to help them create public value. I also started doing something a bit different. On the side, I started investing very tiny amounts of my own money on my own time into tech startups. We're talking about really exceptionally tiny amounts just of my own personal disposable income. But even though they were tiny amounts, I felt this pull to do it. Remember, I had mentioned that I graduated from UC Berkeley and I'd been there during the 90s. Well, that was during the dot-com boom. And that was a time from about 93 to around 2000 when everything was going digital. Everything was getting put on the internet. So if you had a traditional pet store, nobody was interested. But if you took that and put .com on the end, if you made it pets.com and tried to make it a digital business, all of a sudden that was seen as the next big thing. Same thing with a digital toy store. So if you had a brick and mortar toy store, that was not interesting to anyone. But if you called it eToys and put it on the internet, all of a sudden this was the thing that was going to mint money. I named those two examples specifically because they were two of the biggest and most notorious failures from that time. Those companies both skyrocketed in value and then totally imploded. So there were a lot of failures during that time, but there were also a lot of successes. Companies that are still with us today and are still dominant today: eBay, PayPal, Amazon, Google, all of these were founded during that first .com wave. There have been other crashes and then successive waves of digitization during the subsequent 20 years. But that first wave, there was that sense of something new and something emerging, that people were working on something important, even a little bit of a sense of mission. So I want to just characterize what I saw first in the federal sector and then now in the private sector, specifically in Silicon Valley, in the world of tech and venture investing. There are some similarities in what it feels like to work in those two places. In the federal government, I would imagine a lot of the people in the audience today would agree, the bad days can be really bleak. You feel sometimes like there's too much bureaucracy, there's too much politics, both on Capitol Hill as well as internally within your agency. Things are moving too slowly. You feel like everything is futile. But on those good days, those rare good days, you feel like when you get that program enacted or something launched or an objective attained for the agency, you feel like you're doing something important. You feel like you're steering society to where it needs to go. That same set of high and low sentiments exists in the startup world and the tech world as well. On the bad days, it's grim. You feel like there's too much chaos in the startup, whether you're the founder trying to build the startup or you're the investor who put the money in and now you're cheering for it, but you feel like there's too much chaos, there's not enough money to keep the company alive, there's too much uncertainty about whether this thing that the founders have been working on and you've been investing in, will it just fail after all these years and just make all of that a wasted effort? But on the good days, those rare good days, it feels important. It feels like, just like in government where you feel like you're guiding society where it needs to go, in tech, you can get the sense that you're building the future, that you're building the society of tomorrow. That feeling always stuck with me. So back a decade ago, when I had just finished grad school, was starting to work as a federal contractor with federal agencies, I started doing these small scale investments because I felt that there was that activity happening, that in the West Coast, really someone was out there building the future. And about 2 years ago, I finally went all in. I sold my place in the DC area, donated the car, just moved back out west to where I had gone to college, right back into the heart of it. I now live a couple miles down the road from Google's world headquarters, so I'm really smack in the middle of it. And my job now is to invest a mix of mostly other people's money with a little bit of my own sprinkled in, just to make sure I have some skin in the game, which is very standard for VC funds. And my job is to see what's happening and to make my picks. So the first part of that is to meet with founders of really interesting early stage companies. And I'm talking about lots of them, hundreds of them. Back before COVID happened and we had to stop doing in-person, face-to-face coffee meetings, I think my record was 9 coffee meetings in one day in a single cafe. For those of you who've never tried that, 9 back-to-back coffee meetings is just a breathtaking amount of liquid to ingest, so I don't recommend it. But now, of course, COVID is here, so all those coffee meetings have become Zoom meetings, but it's still the same basic imperative, which is volume, first and foremost. As close as I can humanly get to it, I want to see practically every single early stage company in the Valley. I want to see thousands of them on my radar, meet with hundreds of them on my short list, and then pick out a dozen or a couple of dozen a year that are the very best that I want to invest in. This is common to almost all VCs. They want to see huge volumes, pick their best, and then hope that a small fraction of the ones they pick end up being ultra successful. As a small fund, my fund can't even play in those major, larger rounds, the so-called lettered rounds, the Series A, Series B, Series C rounds that bigger VCs do that can easily be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. For a small fund like mine, I have to come in even before that Series A. I come in at the seed round when that early stage company, maybe just a few people, a couple of founders and a couple of employees, they're just poking around looking for some early funding to get started. Maybe we're talking at most between $500,000 and a couple $1 million. And remember, that money is split up across 5 or 6 different engineers and programmers that might be on staff. And the company may not even have a product in market yet. So we're talking about taking that maybe 500K or $1 million, splitting it up across salaries for 5 or 6 people, and then having to make that last for 12 months, maybe 18 if they can. That's not a lot of time. Those companies have to figure out during those 12 or 18 months how to make a product, sell it, and start getting some money in. And if they don't, as a company, they're dead. The failure rates in VC are extremely high. People don't understand this if you're outside of the industry. Most good VCs will bake it right into their financial projections for their VC firm that somewhere between 50% and 75% of their bets will fail completely. And that's not just a loss of a little bit of money or a failure to make an upside. That is losing all of the money you bet. And that's losing that 100% of your bet on 75% of your bets. So it really comes down to that one that you invest in that becomes big, that becomes the Amazon or the Google of this new generation, that has the potential to not only make up and cover your losses, but actually make up for a multiple of your losses. And that's the pull. That's why people get drawn to this place and this space, this conceptual space called Silicon Valley. because there's that prospect of picking companies that look incredibly high potential, supporting them with some financial and non-financial support. And then although most of them will fail, a couple of them might actually achieve what they set out to achieve, which is to change the way society functions. And I think we'd probably all agree that companies like Amazon and Google have done just that. They have changed the way we function as a society. So the idea today is for us to talk about little things that the federal agencies that are supporting innovation and seeking innovation might learn from VCs. So I want to talk first about the similarities between the federal innovation supporting process and the VC tech supporting process. And then I want to get onto the good stuff, which is really the differences. But we have to cover the similarities just to draw the parallels first. So I'm going to try to cover those pretty quickly. Let's talk first about how a government agency, a federal agency, would go about supporting innovation and probably seeking innovation. The first thing a government agency would need to do is see what's out there. They would need to go to some conferences, maybe even host a conference or two. They need to do an RFI or call for white papers. The goal of this first step is simply to see what's happening in the state of the industry. Then they have to figure out which ones to back. Now, this could be through grants. That's a very common method. Generally, those grants would be non-dilutive to the existing owners of equity of that startup. And by the way, I will say that that phrase non-dilutive for a VC like me, it's like catnip for me, because it means that a lot of money from the federal government has gone into developing that technology without having to take equity off the table. So that is really just like the golden phrase for a VC. There can even be deeper levels of engagement and collaboration. For example, a government could just put out a contract and become a customer to those startups or to those tech companies. But let's think, for the purpose of this talk, primarily about grant making, although again, there are always those downstream possibilities, even some other ones like collaboratively developing technology or government providing some staff time or some other government resources besides money. But broadly speaking, we can think about the canonical example as being offering a phase 1 grant or some other type of innovation grant that's non-dilutive. The question, though, is how do the government agencies decide? What's the process for deciding who gets those grants? Well, broadly speaking, I would say that the way governments think about it is they want the grants to go to the projects that have the most merit. Who's actually deciding that? Well, usually it's government officials. It is government staff. Ideally, it would be government staff who are specialists in that particular field of research or engineering that are doing the assessing and the scoring and the awarding. There can be other mechanisms too. Sometimes the government agency will appoint an independent third-party panel or a peer review panel that is outside the government or has members from outside the government. But either way, whether it's an independent panel or within the government agency, a team within the government, the key word here is merit. We're trying to pick the teams, the startups, the tech companies that are deserving, the ones that ought to get that capital. So we've talked about the first step, which is seeing what's out there. We've talked about then the process of figuring out which ones to back. Then there's the final step, which is providing that support. Of course, you've got the upfront support, but then there's also ongoing support. So if that company ends up getting a phase 1 grant, then generally the idea is that the government agency would be pretty willing to encourage it to then go along and hit its milestones and show continued progress and eventually get the phase 2 grant, the phase 3 grant, maybe even go to those even bigger later stage formats of engagement, like maybe becoming a vendor to the government so that the government is your customer. But again, the emphasis here is on having those projects that now the government is supporting, at least with that phase 1 money, to have that project be supported by the government on an ongoing basis based on demonstrated results and continuing merit and milestones being hit. This is not that dissimilar to how VCs think about it. So again, we're talking about the similarities first, and then we'll get in a minute to the juicy part, which is the differences. But the similarities are definitely there. VCs want to start by seeing as many deals as possible. There may be some boundaries around that. So like, for example, my fund is stage constrained. So I'm looking at primarily seed stage deals. Some funds may have a chosen sector or theme, but within that broad box, VCs, as a first step, generally want to see everything. Then they want to figure out which ones are poised to be the winners. Now, entire volumes can be written about that second step of how you pick the winners. But for now, just understand that that's the second step, is to pick which horses to bet on. Then that third step is to support them, first with that initial check, then with ongoing support, non-financial support in the form of helping them meet customers, helping them hire the right talent to build out their teams, advising them on what internal systems they should be instituting within their company to allow it to grow, and then eventually putting in more money when that company goes on to do its follow-on rounds. So we've talked about how a federal agency does a first scan to see what's out there, then figures out which ones to award, then provides that initial and then ongoing support. And we've seen that VCs do a very similar thing. They try to see all the deals out there, pick some winners, and then provide them with financial and non-financial support. So that's our framework here. We can boil it down to three things, three steps that both the federal agencies that are seeking innovation and VCs do at their core. It's sourcing, then picking, and finally supporting. So that three-part sequence is common to both kinds of entity, to a federal agency that's trying to trigger and catalyze some support, and a VC that is trying to invest in that technology. Those are the similarities. The common thread is the sourcing, then picking, then supporting sequence. Now let's talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about the differences. Because again, the goal here is not just to talk about similarities, right? The goal today is to try to identify things that might be of value to the federal agencies, lessons learned or ways of doing things and mindsets from the VC world. So the lessons, if there are any, are going to exist in the differences. Let's start with step one of that three-step process. Again, it's sourcing, picking, supporting. Let's look at sourcing. Quick recap, how do federal agencies do sourcing? They want to see who's working on technologies that might be of value to that agency's mission. Here's where the first difference lies. VCs don't have any set agenda. They don't have a public mission. Of course, their internal mission, their private mission is to make money for the people that put money into that VC fund. But other than that, there's no set existing or pre-existing mission. Now, yes, again, there are those boxes, right? So you may have a sectoral constraint or a geographic constraint, or in my case, a stage constraint. So you might have an artificial intelligence fund that's only investing in artificial intelligence businesses. Or if you had a fund that was in Seattle, it might only be investing in businesses that are springing up in the Northwest. But outside of those broad limits, VCs don't care about what problem that business is solving. What they care about is that whatever business that business is trying to solve, they care about that being a very valuable problem to solve if the business can figure out how to solve it. This is an incredibly important distinction between what federal agencies do and what VCs do. Feds are looking for something that supports the mission of that agency. VCs don't have a pre-existing mission. They don't care what problem that business is solving, as long as it's a problem that is massively valuable to solve. I want to quickly go through some noteworthy exceptions to that, but the exceptions really prove the rule here. I think that the exceptions I'm going to give you are not the predominant way that VCs work, but I'll mention them just to be thorough here. Some VC firms do have investment theses where they try to state upfront what kinds of businesses they want to invest in. An example of one that I'll give you that is from a firm that is very well respected and that I deeply admire is the following statement, and I think you'll see immediately why there's a limitation to what an investment thesis statement can do for a VC firm. So this is from a VC firm that I really admire. Its investment thesis statement is: we back trusted brands that broaden access to knowledge, capital, and well-being by leveraging networks, platforms, and protocols. Now, what am I supposed to do with that? That is such a massively broad statement that practically any business that VC fund decides to invest in could ultimately be shoehorned into that definition because it's so broad. So I don't think in practice that investment thesis statements that you see on the websites of all these VC firms really make that much difference. They look good on a website, they sound very impressive, but they don't in practice end up dictating what kind of companies the VCs invest in. And even smaller number of VC firms will go further than that, and they'll experiment with what are called RFSs, requests for startups. Just like in the federal government, you'll have an RFI or an RFP. Some VC firms try to do an RFS, a request for startups, which is trying to really predict or do a request up front for what kind of businesses solving specific problems they want to invest in. I've seen requests for startup statements such as this: we want to invest in companies that are working on technologies that have a potential to expand or extend the human lifespan. We want to invest in companies that are working to enhance performance of industrial batteries. Those are the kinds of statements you might see in a request for startups. But these initiatives that are trying to put these requests out, they seem to come and go. They always seem to be very short-lived. And they seem to not really end up being the predominant way that VCs function. Again, these are the exceptions that prove the rule. The way VCs really work is they look at everything that's happening and they say, what's out there? And let's look for big, big winners. So we've talked about how sourcing is very different between the federal government and VCs. Federal government agencies are trying to match businesses to the mission of that agency. VCs, broadly speaking, don't care. They just want to find a business that's working on solving a massively valuable problem. How about the next step? How about picking? Well, how does the federal government go about picking? Again, we talked about this a little bit already. They have the intent to channel funds to the companies that are doing the most meritorious work, the thinkers, the innovators, the teams and companies and technologies that are deserving of public funds. VCs don't care about merit, not in that sense, not in the sense of being deserving. If you ask VCs how they really see themselves as operating, what they see themselves as doing is not picking meritorious deals, but rather picking contrarian deals. They want to find contrarian companies, contrarian technologies. Now, what does this mean, and why is it so important for VCs to adopt this contrarian mindset? Because it turns out that if, as a VC, you are completely correct about your hypothesis on a given company. So you say, this company over here, company XYZ, we have a hypothesis that this company is going to be the next big thing. It's going to be the next Amazon or next Google. It's going to be massive. But you're merely right. So your hypothesis is dead right, but it's right without being also contrarian. Then what that means is, as a VC, all you're doing is recognizing the potential of that company based on the evidence that everyone else can already see. And if everybody else can see that evidence, then that means your competitors, the other VC funds, have already seen it, and they've probably already invested, which means you are too late. You've already missed the boat. So in VC, you have to be, if you're going to be successful, you have to be two things: right, but also right in a contrarian way. Let me give an example of this to make it a little more concrete. Take a company like Airbnb. Almost everyone laughed at the idea. In some cases, literally laughed in their faces when the founders of Airbnb said, we're going to have a business that lets you sleep in a stranger's house, or if you have the house, you can have a stranger sleep in your house, in your bed. Now Airbnb is valued at about $30 billion, so no one's laughing anymore. But in the early days, they were turned down not just by a few VCs, but by dozens of VCs. So I guess maybe those VCs weren't as contrarian as they hoped or thought that they were. The thing is, being contrarian is very, very difficult. Why is it so difficult? It's because human beings, we're a social species, and so we all want to fit in. We don't like having an opinion that is too far outside the mainstream. I would encourage everyone right now to just do this little internal thought experiment with yourselves. What is a belief that you strongly believe in that almost no one else you know agrees with? Now, the wording of that last phrase is very important, so I'm going to say it again. Can you come up with a belief that you strongly believe in that is believed not just by a minority of people, but actually that almost no one else you know in your entire network of friends, family, colleagues, that almost no one else you know agrees with? Try doing that either right now or later at home, tonight, or the weekend. It is exceptionally difficult to come up with a truly contrarian belief. I would almost wager that almost nobody in the audience today, or any of us on the panel, can even come up with a single contrarian belief that is authentically contrarian. It is exceptionally hard. For a while, I had one proudly held contrarian belief. And my belief for many years was that remote work was coming and that there was going to be a moment that we would just switch over to it. And systematically, when I brought this up with smart friends of mine and colleagues, they would either argue with me or scoff at that belief or dismiss it. And then COVID happened and people were forced to go remote. And then it turns out that both employees and employers see that there are some benefits to going remote. So even if not everyone loves it, at least people now are recognizing that there might be some benefits to it. You don't have to do a commute. You don't have to have all this expensive real estate as the employer. So it was kind of bittersweet for me to get vindicated on that, because yes, I was proven right. But the problem is, this is the elusive thing about contrarian beliefs. The moment everybody starts seeing it, you don't have a contrarian belief anymore. So it's bittersweet for me because now I got to go find another contrarian belief, and it's hard to do. So again, I would challenge you all to go and ask yourself, do you really have any contrarian beliefs, or do you just believe the same things that a lot of other people do? This is what makes startup founders such interesting people, because a lot of them are deeply contrarian. And if the VCs who invest in them are any good, they're contrarian as well. Because if they are picking something to work on, to build as a startup company, if it's contrarian, nobody wants to fund you, but it also means that nobody wants to enter that market. And so you can just sweep through that market if you build a business that works well. Let me give you some other examples of some of the different flavors of contrarian idea. The first flavor is an idea that's just dismissed offhand because it seems silly until it's proven not to be silly. We talked about Airbnb. This is a classic example of a contrarian idea that ended up being very right as well as very contrarian. Some variations on that. How about an idea that has been done many times before, but no one has ever quite gotten it exactly right, so that there have been some moderate successes, but finally somebody nails it. But nobody believes that it's going to be valuable because all the precursors who have been doing that before have not made much of a success out of it. Google is a great example of this. I'm going to ask if anybody happens to be on chat and wants to mention, can we even remember? Feel free to put it in the chat if you can remember some of the examples of search engines, not just search boxes on a specific website, but World Wide Web search engines that existed before Google. How many of them can you name? Let's see if anybody's got some for me in the chat here.
I see Yahoo, Mozilla, Ask Jeeves, Netscape.
So Netscape and Mozilla were not search engines. They were browsers, but they did have embedded search engines. But yes, Yahoo was one, Ask Jeeves. Turns out there were 12 search engines before Google. And the VCs that Google approached almost uniformly told them, look, we already have 12 search engines. Why do we need a 13th? But here's the thing that they didn't realize. Google was two computer science PhDs out of Stanford who came up with an incredibly elegant algorithm for search called PageRank. And they completely nailed the user experience for search. Today, after being turned down by dozens of VCs, Google is now worth something like $1 trillion. That's $1,000 billion. And they have like 80, 90% market share dominance in search. So they've won the game. But they were the 13th search engine. So for that simple reason, no one thought that we needed number 13 if we already had 12. Let me give you another variant on what a contrarian idea can look like. How about a maturing idea, an idea whose time has finally come? Here's a fun question for you. Does anybody happen to know the name of a major tech company that launched a ride-sharing service, very similar to Uber, just a couple of years before Uber did? And maybe, Jeff, if you can see if there are any people who know the answer or want to take a guess at the answer.
We have one that says Lyft.
Lyft came after Uber, so I'm looking for the one that came before, and I will give you a hint. This is a company we've all heard of. In fact, we've heard of it very, very, very recently, like in the last 50 seconds.
Yellow Cab.
The answer, I'll give you the answer. Good guesses, everyone, but the answer is Google. In 2005, Google launched a ride-sharing service. But the problem is they launched it as a web-based service. So you had to go onto your computer, type in your request for a ride, and then hope that a car would come to the address you specified in the ride sharing user interface on your computer. This just didn't work, and so it never took off. And so if you had been that Google engineer who was chatting with one of the founders of Uber 4 years later when Uber launched in 2009, you would have said, no, that's not going to work. We already tried that. But what they would have failed to realize is that, unlike in 2005, there was a difference in the market, which is that everybody had one of these in their pocket. You have a supercomputer in your pocket now that can not only do the booking as a web-based function, but can also provide GPS so that the driver of the car knows where you are and you can see where the car is. And on top of that, it has a payment function. So now suddenly the time for ride sharing was right, but nobody realized that about Uber because it had been done before and the time wasn't right when it was tried earlier. This was another company. Uber is another one that was turned down by a lot of VCs who are now kicking themselves because they would have made about 4,000 times their money if they had put money in on Uber's seed round. So we've talked about the second step, which is picking. Let's talk about the third step, which is supporting. Again, this is the step that both federal agencies that are seeking innovation and VCs have to do. They have to support their picks once they make that pick. But let's talk about the differences in how they do that. Broadly speaking, the mindset in the federal government is a mindset of stewardship. That company that you just awarded, let's say, a phase 1 grant to, is now a publicly supported project. So you want to see it succeed. They are now a government partner. So you want to support them and work with them and encourage them to make their way down those milestones, hit those milestones, earn that phase 2 grant, get that phase 3 money. As a government agency, we've selected you, we like you, we want you to succeed. VCs don't think like that. VCs want to figure out as early as possible which ones are going to be the big winners in their portfolio. And then what do? They put almost all of their focus and their resources, including follow-on money, but also non-financial resources, into supporting and growing those big winners. This is a completely different mindset to the even-handed stewardship that federal agencies do with all of their awardees. VCs don't do that even-handed stewardship. They do something that you could probably better call ruthless triaging. The implication here is that imagine you're a startup that's doing okay and you're in that VC's portfolio. You're like a somewhat deserving member to be in that portfolio. You're hitting some of your milestones, you're growing a little bit, you're making some encouraging progress. In practice, it doesn't matter. You're probably still going to get the cold shoulder from that VC. Now, they might go through the motions of being supported, but in practice, they're putting all of their effort and all of their attention into that big winner, or if they're lucky, maybe 2 big winners in their portfolio, which means that you, as the also ran in the portfolio, right, the runner-up, you're not going to get much support, and you're probably not going to get that follow-on check. In extreme examples, there are anecdotes of VC firms that will actually refuse to answer the calls of their underperforming portfolio companies. Now, I emphasize this is an extreme example. It's not usually quite that blatant. But there is this like thinly veiled, contemptuous sense of indifference that VCs give towards portfolio companies that are clearly not becoming the one big skyrocketing winner. Why does it have to be this way? Well, we talked about it and we hinted at it a little bit earlier in the conversation, which is that when you're a VC, you're picking a dozen or a couple dozen companies, but you're hoping that your picks aren't just 1 in a dozen or 1 in 100. You're hoping that you had some skill and you picked at least one in your portfolio that is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, which means it's going to go be a $1 billion company. And it's just a different type of thinking. You're not thinking in terms of evenly supporting all of the companies in your portfolio. With the federal government, there's an implication that having most or all of the awardees in your portfolio succeed is attainable, it's realistic, and it's also desirable. In VC, it's seen as neither of those things. It's much more Darwinian. It's like if you took a bunch of people and threw them in a swimming pool, and you're expecting that some of them might struggle to swim. But unlike in the federal government, where you're going to try to support them as much as you can, in the VC world, when some of them start to struggle, you might do the minimal effort of throwing a few of them some life preservers. But the real game is not to help those guys swim or get out of the pool. The real game is to look and see carefully, oh, which one of you is going to be the next Michael Phelps? Which one is zooming across to the other end of the pool? it's not about the ones that are struggling. It's about that one breakout success, not a uniform group of evenly well-deserved awardees. You're always looking for that one exceptional talent, the one exceptional breakout. So those are the differences between how VCs think and how federal agencies think in those 3 steps in the sequence: the sourcing, the picking, and then the supporting. What are the implications here? What are the implications for how federal agencies might think about doing some of their innovation seeking activities a little bit differently? Well, the first thing I want to say is a personal opinion that I think the media have done a terrible job of. They've really undersold how much innovation the federal government has catalyzed for our society. Let me give you an example. Starting in around the 1980s, in response to the frequent question people would ask of, I'm a taxpayer, I'm putting all this money into all these space programs and NASA, what am I getting for my taxpayer money? Does anybody happen to know any of or all of the 3 examples in the media that the media were notorious for citing as examples we give to the world of technologies that were commercialized by NASA-funded research? And I'm talking about 3 very specific examples of very, very particular technologies that were seen in and around people's homes and their lives. So maybe we can see if we have any guesses at that in the chat, or maybe some people remember from back in the 80s.
We have one that says washing machine, microwave, another that says GPS.
So somebody's
Tang.
already Tang. That's the first one of the 3. So there's a notorious trio I'm talking about. And
Apple phone, solar panels, fountain pen upside down.
The fountain pen is a good one. That one came a little later, but Tang is one of them. The 3 I'm thinking of are so notorious that NASA has a page on its website about these 3. The 3 examples that were always cited in one breath by journalists were Tang, Teflon, and Velcro. Often in the same article, just like, I think there must have been a press release that went out or something, and just people grabbed it and ran with it when they were writing these articles. So for those who don't know, Tang is a very interestingly flavored dry powder orange drink. Teflon is what you coat frying pans with so it doesn't stick. And then Velcro is what helps 5-year-olds with putting their shoes on. What's the bonus fact here? What's the interesting thing that all 3 of these have in common? Does anybody know? I'll give you a hint. It's a trick question about these 3 NASA commercialized technologies.
One person says commercialization.
It's actually the opposite of that. The funny thing is, none of these technologies were actually commercialized by NASA. Tang was developed by General Foods, but it was popularized by the astronaut John Glenn. Teflon was developed by DuPont, but it was used in NASA heat shields. Velcro was a Swiss invention from the 1940s, but it was used in NASA spacesuits. So it makes you wonder, was this really the best that journalists could come up with? These arguably useful, but kind of oddball inventions that actually weren't even NASA funded in the first place. NASA has a page on its website to debunk these myths about Tang, Teflon, and Velcro. And I remember reading these articles as if NASA's big contribution to humanity was helping 5-year-olds with their shoes. The crying shame here is that federal engineering and research support has ushered in thousands of new technologies and even entire industries. But I think people don't really have a grasp of this. Since we're talking about NASA, what about the space industry itself? It's fashionable to talk about the private space industry. Private companies like SpaceX are worth billions now, and they're attempting low-cost reusable flights. But it was the space shuttle that was the original proof of concept for reusable spacecraft, which in turn was built on decades of work in rocketry and satellite launches. So for that taxpayer who's grumbling about their tax dollars going to NASA, do you like knowing the weather? Because that comes from weather satellites. Do you like your little navigation system? Because that's GPS. Let's pick a couple more areas quickly of huge public value created by government support for innovation. What about the Human Genome Project? That has ushered in immense new areas of research. But it was originally funded as a collaboration between US national labs and the National Institutes of Health, among other institutions. Thanks to that Human Genome Project, we now know the full genetic sequence of human beings, which means we can figure out what genes are causing what conditions and traits. We can screen for genetic conditions. We can develop gene therapies, treatments for diseases. This is nothing less than knowing finally the exact genetic code that makes a human a human. And lastly, what about this medium that we're talking to each other through today? We so readily take this for granted. The internet is just here. It started out as a research project at DARPA. Okay, so let's see. This is a network that not only lets me talk to a bunch of people across multiple cities and countries and continents in real time, but also lets us store and exchange all the world information and transfer and search that information with just the ease of a few keystrokes or taps on my phone. Yeah, I think I'm going to take one of those, please. So when we're talking about the public value that federally sponsored innovation has created, it's not just Tang, Teflon, Velcro, regardless of how much that Velcro may or may not have helped me as a 5-year-old with my shoes. It did. Instead of that list of apocryphal NASA inventions, let's talk about how the entire space industry, the entire human genome project, the entire internet. These are examples of massive public value created by government-supported innovation. So let's get back to that question at hand. What, if anything, can innovation-supporting federal agencies learn from how VCs go about their work? Again, if there are lessons to be learned, they're going to reside in the differences. So let's go through them again. When it comes to sourcing, does it always create the most public value to define problems in terms of what the agency knows it needs today? Or could there be moments when a more agnostic VC-style approach of just reviewing broad volumes of new technologies would actually surface something compelling? Is it possible to justify committing taxpayer dollars into a broad exploratory scan of intriguing technologies? Did the people working on that ARPANET at DARPA realize that what they were building would become someday not just a method for a few supercomputing centers at different universities to communicate and trade information, but rather a method for the entire human species to communicate, conduct business, store, transfer, and search information? The public value created there was unimaginably larger than the original goals of the project. But would it have been, or would it be today, a valid use of taxpayer dollars to conduct those kinds of fishing expeditions, those broad scans, to try to land another such world-changing innovation, even if it's not initially or obviously tied to that mission of that sponsoring federal agency? When it comes to picking, can you make a case to shift systems for reviewing and awarding grants away from that traditional approach, that merit-based approach, towards something that's more contrarian-minded? Remember my caution from earlier. I want to just reiterate, it's exceptionally difficult even to get a single human being to be truly contrarian. So maybe trying to institutionalize contrarian thinking into federal processes for grant making is just a fool's errand. Or maybe it's not so hopeless. There have been some interesting attempts to build contrarian thinking actually into organizations. One interesting idea is the concept of a designated dissenter, someone whose sole purpose in meetings is to sit there and intentionally introduce dissent. They are instructed to try to tear apart anything that looks like consensus emerging in the room, and instead push just breathlessly for those underdog ideas that other people are dismissing as laughable. We already have federal set-asides for small businesses and for minorities. Could you do some kind of earmarking, some kind of federal set-aside for ideas that are contrarian? And when it comes to supporting, is there a case to be made for applying Darwinian mindsets to federal innovation grants? Are there scenarios where it makes sense to ditch some of the projects that are just merely performing in a mediocre level, just they're adequately performing, in favor of throwing the weight of that program or even the entire agency behind some single new technology that might be emerging as world-changing? Now, I'm not saying that I have all the answers, and in fact, there are some very good ethical reasons why broadly federal innovation programs have evolved the way they have, to seek innovation that's tied to an agency mission, that's deemed to have some merit, and that is then provided ongoing public support and funding as a publicly supported project. So I'm not proposing that all of that precedent be thrown out and that the entire federal government just switch over, from one day to the next to operate like a full-fledged VC firm. But I just wonder if there might be some moments where that kind of little shift in focus from fully mission-oriented to a little more agnostic, from merit-driven to a little more contrarian, and from even-handed ongoing support to a little more ruthless triaging, might help us uncover the next mega technology that could generate not just massive private value, but possibly unlock enormous public value as well. With that, I hope my comments today are not only a little thought-provoking, but hopefully also question provoking because I think we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, Rob. If folks do have questions, let me ask you to do one of two things. You can either type them into the question box or you can just raise your hand, in which case we'll call on you and unmute you. And while maybe someone is thinking about it, let me ask Rob, my thought was the biggest difference from venture capital to the federal government is the venture capital asks for equity and the federal government doesn't. Does that make sense to you? Should that continue?
If I want to say something that might be a bit controversial here, the federal government, in a way, through monetary policy, is actually taking stakes in private securities now through quantitative easing. So we're already doing that in a way. Now, whether that should be done one technology company at a time, I think that if my instinct was that that was the way to go, maybe I would have made that more of a core topic of my talk. I'm not sure that's the way to go. I think that it's more about rethinking some of the ways that we, as I said, that we source, that we pick, and that we support. I think that might be the more interesting direction that federal agencies could investigate.
Okay. We have a question online from Stephen Lowe who says, how do you interpret or reinterpret return on investment in the context of public value creation?
This is what's so tricky about public value, is there's no good way to measure it. And if there were one metric that we could, against which we could score public value, you could rate any government agency, any politician, and any administration, right? And just say, well, they scored an 87 and the last administration was a 36, so therefore they're creating more public value, right? It's always going to be a trade-off. With VC, it's much easier. So look, we have the simpler task, right? We make some money, and the more money we make, the better we did for the people who invested in our fund. But I think the point I was getting at with the talk is that I don't know what the public value of the internet was, but it was mind-bogglingly large. I think we're going to see the same thing for the Human Genome Project and also for the space industry. And so I think that it's not a question of trying to measure the ROI. It's the tantalizing possibility for me if governments could use more nuanced approaches and might hit upon that next thing. What about if we hadn't invented the internet? Or what about what's the thing we haven't invented yet that is just sitting there that we could stumble upon if we had a more broadly defined, broadly imagined form of government support?
Okay. We have another question, this one from Michael Howell, who says, do you think the government innovation initiatives like DIUX align with your recommendations, and if so, should be expanded? I may have to ask Mike whether you can either type in or we can unmute you to ask what is DIUX for those who do not know it. Ashley, is it possible for you to unmute Mike Howell if he's got a microphone?
Looks like Mike might be self-muted. So Mike, if you want to, go ahead and you can unmute yourself, or you can just send your response to the question. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, we can hear you, Mike.
Yeah, what I was referring to is there's several initiatives in the government. The first one, DIUX, was the Defense Innovation Skunkworks kind of initiative. They do phased granting. They put out a problem statement, find and select among offerers, and do incremental funding based on, are you successful in phase? It's an equivalent to like phase A, B, C, VC. There's similar in DHS. There's similar in some of the defense components. And I'm just curious how much, if you're familiar with them, how much you think they do align with or don't align with the sort of the principles and the model you described that VCs use.
I don't know DIUX that well, but I am familiar with some of the other innovation initiatives like CarbX, 18F. There are a few of these that are trying to like just go in a completely different direction and try something, you know, very new in federal processes. I think it's great, and I think that the test though of whether they really are branching out into a new way of doing it instead of just replicating what we already have is, are they willing to fund things that aren't directly tied to any specific present day agency mission? That's very difficult, because that's how government employees, government staff, and government managers get reviewed for their annual performance reviews, right? Like, how are you contributing to the agency mission? But the thing is, if you always have it tied to the mission, then you're not going to bubble up some of these potentially world-changing initiatives. So to answer the question, I don't know the specifics of DIUX, but from what I just was able to quickly Google here, you know, to the extent that they are able to the extent we can redefine merit as not being necessarily helping that agency with that problem today, but just merit because what they're working on seems to be a groundbreaking field of technology, I think that would be really interesting.
So we have one more question. We'll probably have to make this the last, and it is from Chad Ross. He says, as far as the stretch you suggest for government agencies, are there closer analogs that the government could draw from social venture funds specifically, those that use community social or social responsibility criteria for selection? And I think he's asking kind of, would those be a better match for kind of analogies to the government than perhaps a straight up venture capitalist?
That is itself an entirely independent sector, right? Some people call it the CSR sector. In venture, it's called ESG, environmental social governance. You can call it impact investing. Most of the major VC funds say that they invest in companies that have an impact, but they don't have if you look at their actual agreement with the people who invest in the fund, there's no formal language that they are trying to maximize impact, you know, social impact. So then there are some funds that are explicitly stood up as impact funds.
Great.
That
so
would take.
I hope you all. Sorry.
That would take a whole hour, another hour to talk about. But I think that as somebody who spent a lot of my life working in the public sector to try to work towards a social mission, I am a huge fan of seeing more impact funds arise, but it's tough for some of them to compete with straight up financially driven VC funds that are making billions of dollars by betting on the big companies of their generation.
Sure. So I want to extend my personal thanks, Rob. It is great to hear from you. I think these are a bunch of really interesting points that you've raised. I hope folks will join me in thanking you. I do want to mention we are always inviting ideas and suggestions for either topics or problems or specific speakers. We usually have these analytics breakfast events every 2 months. We haven't got a specific date set for November yet. There are a couple of topics that we're contemplating. I'm going to share what they are with you. We haven't locked them down, but would love to have your suggestions as well. One of those topics is perhaps a person from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services who may be able to talk about using analytics to think about how a federal agency can address significant changes in demand and volume so that it can both plan in advance and then respond quickly. Because of course, USCIS has had significant changes in volume of immigrants. The other topic is essentially trying to understand how analytics, use analytics to understand impacts of the COVID pandemic. And that might include folks who would be perhaps from the Small Business Administration, Department of the Treasury, and of course, HHS. So we're trying to kind of work on a potential presentation on one or another, or perhaps both of those events. But I would like to invite any of you who are participating to share your suggestion about a topic or about a particular type of analytics technique or a method or a particular agency or speaker that you would like to hear from. And as always, let me ask Jennifer Bachner, do you have any last comments you would like to make as our host with Johns Hopkins University's program in government analytics?
No, but I just want to thank our speaker. I thought it was a fantastic talk. I learned a lot, and I know some of the participants did as well, given the comments that are coming in. So very grateful that you could speak with us today.
It's my pleasure, Jen. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.